Key bell above the diner's door jingled as Jack Mason stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon hitting him like a wave. It was the kind of place that had seen decades of wear, faded booths, checkered floors, an old jukebox humming low in the corner. A place where regulars nursed black coffee for hours, and outsiders were given a once-over before being ignored. Jack had seen plenty of diners like this, small-town America tucked away from the rush of big cities, where folks either welcomed you like family or treated you like a stranger who'd overstayed his welcome. He wasn't looking for trouble, just a meal. His boots scuffed against the worn linoleum as he walked toward the counter, adjusting the strap of his weathered military duffel over his shoulder. His joints ached from the road, too many years in the service, too many nights spent sleeping in places that weren't meant for comfort. A waitress in her early 20s, blonde hair tied back, pencil tucked behind her ear, gave him a polite nod as he slid onto a stool. She was moving fast, balancing plates and scribbling down orders, but she still made time to acknowledge him. "Be right with you, sir," she called over her shoulder. Jack gave her a nod, setting his duffel at his feet. Then he saw the owner, Carl Briggs. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you." Now, back to the story. A heavy-set man with graying hair and a perpetual scowl, Carl was the kind of guy who thought respect was something that only went one way. He stood behind the counter, arms crossed over his broad chest. A stained apron stretched over his gut. Carl's eyes landed on Jack's worn military jacket, the patches sewn onto the sleeve, and his expression twisted. Jack knew the look. He'd seen it before. Not admiration, not gratitude, resentment. Carl stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "You lost, buddy?" Jack glanced up from the menu. "Nope, just looking for a meal." Carl snorted. "Yeah? Well, we're full." Jack raised an eyebrow, scanning the nearly half-empty diner. Plenty of open booths, plenty of stools at the counter. "Looks like you've got space," Jack said evenly. Carl's lip curled. "Not for your kind." Jack set the menu down slowly. He'd been called a lot of things in his life. Soldier, Marine, brother. Some things better left unsaid. But this? He could feel the eyes of other customers on them now, forks pausing halfway to mouths, the waitress at the far end of the counter freezing in place. Jack stayed calm. "And what kind would that be?" Carl smirked. "The kind always looking for handouts, expecting the world to bend over just 'cause you wore a uniform." Jack's fingers tightened into a fist beneath the counter, but his face remained unreadable. Years of discipline kept his pulse steady, his breath even. "I ain't looking for a handout," he said, his voice cool, even. "I was planning to pay like everybody else." Carl snorted. "Yeah, well, not here. I got a right to refuse service, and I don't serve guys like you." The silence in the diner was thick, uneasy. A few customers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one said a damn word. Jack could feel the heat rising in his chest, not from anger, but from something deeper, something heavier. He wasn't a man who begged, not for meals, not for respect. So he pushed back from the counter, slow and deliberate, grabbing his duffel. "Guess I'll take my business elsewhere," he said. He stood to leave, ready to walk out the door. And that's when the voice cut through the silence. Deep, commanding, undeniable. "I don't think so." Jack stopped mid-step. The entire diner turned toward the booth in the corner, the one that had been quiet until now. A man stood up, unfolding himself with the kind of deliberate power that only came from decades of leadership. He was older, but his posture was straight, his presence undeniable. And when Jack turned to get a better look, he saw the 4 stars on the man's neatly pressed jacket. General Robert Tate. The diner held its breath. Carl paled. The game had just changed, and nobody saw it coming. The diner fell into absolute silence. The air felt thick, every eye fixed on the man now standing from the corner booth. Jack recognized him instantly, General Robert Tate. Even after retiring, a 4-star general carried a presence that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the uniform, the way the ribbons on his chest gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights. It was the way he moved, controlled, deliberate, unwavering. A man who had commanded battalions with a single word. A man whose reputation spoke louder than any introduction ever could. Carl Briggs's smirk vanished. His confidence evaporated like a man who just realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. Jack slowly turned back, resting his duffel against his leg, watching as the general strode toward the counter with measured authority. It was like watching a storm roll in, unstoppable, undeniable. General Tate's boots clicked against the tile floor as he stopped just a few feet from Carl. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "Tell me something, Mr. Briggs," Tate said, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of absolute authority. "When exactly did you decide that a man who fought for your freedom wasn't worth a hot meal?" Carl swallowed hard, but the bravado wasn't entirely gone. Not yet. His pride was still fighting for control, though his hands twitched at his sides, betraying his nerves. "This is my place," Carl muttered. "I decide who eats here." Tate's expression didn't change. His blue-gray eyes, sharp as a knife, locked onto Carl's like a predator staring down prey. "Your place," Tate repeated. "A business, I assume, built in a country that gives you the right to operate freely?" He leaned in slightly. "A country that was protected by men like Sergeant Jack Mason." The name hung in the air. A few customers stiffened, whispering among themselves. Some had recognized Jack's face, but hadn't been able to place it. Now, with Tate saying it out loud, the realization clicked for some of them. Jack Mason wasn't just a veteran, he was a decorated soldier. Carl shifted on his feet, but his pride was still clinging to control. "I don't need a history lesson, General." Tate's jaw tensed slightly. He was a man of patience, but that patience had limits. "Let me tell you what's going to happen next," Tate said. "You're going to apologize to Sergeant Mason, and then you're going to serve him a meal, and you're going to do it with the same level of respect you would give any other paying customer." Carl let out a hollow, forced chuckle. "Or what?" Tate didn't blink. "Or I'll make damn sure this is the last business you ever run in this town." The room felt like it shrunk. Carl froze. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The general wasn't bluffing. He didn't need to. A man like Robert Tate had connections and, more importantly, influence. It wouldn't take much, a few phone calls, a well-placed story, and Carl's little diner would be done. Carl's gaze darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But all he found were blank stares, people looking away, suddenly embarrassed to be associated with him. Even his own employees were frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The blonde waitress Emma stood near the coffee machine, hands clenched at her sides, her face filled with barely restrained disgust. Carl's mouth opened and closed, the realization sinking in. He had lost control. Jack stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. He had fought battles in foreign lands, had seen men fall beside him, had carried the weight of war on his back for years. But somehow, this moment, this quiet public exposure of a man's ignorance, felt almost more revealing than any firefight he had ever been in. Carl's jaw tightened. His pride fought him, but the weight of the moment finally crushed whatever resistance he had left. His voice was flat, forced. "Fine, I'll serve him." Tate didn't move, didn't even acknowledge the pathetic attempt at compliance. "I believe I said you were going to apologize first." Carl's entire body went rigid. A few customers stifled gasps. This was beyond humiliation now. This was justice. Carl clenched his teeth, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the counter. Every instinct in his body told him to fight it. But he knew he had already lost. His voice was barely above a mutter. "I'm sorry." Jack didn't move, didn't acknowledge the words at first. He let them sit there, waiting as if to make Carl wallow in the weight of them. Then finally he exhaled and gave a slow nod. "All right," Jack said. "I'll take a coffee and whatever's good today." Carl turned toward the kitchen, face red, his shoulders stiff, and barked an order at the cook. But the energy in the room had shifted permanently. The power dynamic had changed. Carl wasn't in charge anymore. Jack settled back into his seat, resting his arms on the counter. The waitress Emma was at his side instantly, a fresh cup of coffee already in her hands. She set it in front of him, her voice soft but firm. "Your meal's on me, Sergeant." Jack looked at her, studying the quiet fire in her eyes. "That's so?" She nodded. "Yeah, because some people in this place still know how to show respect." Jack gave a small smirk, nodding his thanks before taking a sip of coffee. It was strong, hot, just the way he liked it. General Tate sat back down in his booth, watching the room settle once more. But the tension, the lesson learned tonight, would not be forgotten. Carl Briggs had lost control of his own business, and everyone knew it. Jack didn't need revenge. The moment itself had been enough. And as he sat there, waiting for his meal, the whispers continued around him, not about him, but about Carl. Tonight, the town had learned something. You don't disrespect a veteran, because sometimes, when you do, the right people stand up. And when that happens, everything changes. Carl Briggs moved stiffly as he turned toward the kitchen, his face red with humiliation, his pride shattered before an entire room of witnesses. He barked an order to the cook, his voice sharp, but it lacked the confidence it had carried before. He knew, just as everyone else in that diner knew, that things had changed. The man who once controlled the room had been knocked off his perch, and he wasn't getting back up. Jack didn't gloat. That wasn't his style. He simply leaned back in his seat, hands wrapped around the steaming mug of coffee Emma had placed in front of him. The dark liquid was strong, smooth, and steady, just like the way he carried himself through the years, through war, through every damn battle life had thrown at him. General Tate settled back in his booth, but his eyes still scanned the room, watching the shift in energy with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had won yet another fight without ever having to throw a punch. People whispered, customers exchanged glances. A couple near the window had their phones out, subtly recording, because moments like this didn't just fade away. They spread, and as the word traveled, so would the lesson. Carl slammed a plate down on the counter, the food arranged sloppily in a last attempt at defiance. "Here," he muttered. Jack didn't move right away. He took his time, letting Carl sit in his own failure. Finally, with the patience of a man who had endured worse than a petty diner owner, he reached forward and pulled the plate toward him. Emma, standing nearby, frowned at the sight of the food. It was obvious that Carl had thrown it together carelessly. Burnt toast, an overcooked slab of meat, eggs that looked like they'd been slapped onto the plate without care. Jack simply grabbed his fork, cutting a small piece of the steak. He chewed slowly, swallowing, before setting the fork down. His expression didn't change, but his voice was firm. "You're gonna make this again," Jack said, tapping the plate lightly with his fork. "And you're gonna do it right." Carl's face flushed a deeper shade of red. A few people in the diner gasped. Even General Tate raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Carl's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to say something, wanted to fight back, but there was nothing left to fight. The power was gone, and deep down, he knew it. Emma stepped forward before Carl could say a word. "I'll remake it," she said, snatching the plate off the counter and heading to the back. Carl's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He turned, slamming the kitchen door behind him as he disappeared inside. Jack lifted his coffee to his lips and took another sip, unfazed. Emma returned 10 minutes later, a fresh plate in hand. This time, it was perfect. A thick, juicy steak, eggs cooked to perfection, golden brown toast on the side. She set it down in front of Jack without a word, but her small smile said everything. Jack nodded. "Now that's a meal." She grinned before turning to the next customer, but not before sneaking a look toward the kitchen, where Carl had yet to emerge. Tate chuckled from his seat. "You know, Sergeant, I think you may have just burned that man's ego worse than his damn toast." Jack smirked, cutting into the steak. "Not my fault he can't cook under pressure." Tate lifted his glass in a small toast. "To justice." Jack nodded, taking another bite. "To breakfast." The whispers didn't stop. Customers kept stealing glances toward the counter, toward the kitchen, toward the man who had been put in his place. Carl's reputation was done, and by tomorrow, so would his business. Jack wasn't a man who lived for revenge. He didn't need it. But what happened tonight? This was something different. This was justice. And justice, he figured, tasted a hell of a lot like a perfectly cooked steak. By the time he finished his meal, he could feel the shift in the air, a newfound respect. Not because of anything flashy, not because of some grand speech, but because he stood his ground, and people saw it, and they would remember. Jack reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crisp bills, and left them on the table, far more than the meal cost. Emma saw it, her eyes widening slightly. "You don't have to do that." Jack gave her a look. "You did the right thing tonight?" She bit her lip, nodding. So did you. Jack stood, slinging his duffel over his shoulder, nodding once more toward General Tate, then heading for the door. The second he stepped outside, the cold night air hit his face, crisp and sharp. He paused for a moment, letting it settle in. The world had moved on without him a long time ago. He had seen it happen, felt it deep in his bones. But tonight was different. Because tonight, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. As he walked down the quiet street, hands tucked into his jacket, he didn't bother looking back. He didn't need to, because after tonight, the town wouldn't forget his name. And Carl Briggs, well, he wouldn't forget either. The end.